say that PolicyLink worked really hard on helping make the Sustainable Communities Initiative, if any of you are familiar with that program that came out of the Obama administration to really look at how to do integrated regional planning that addresses housing, economic development, environmental impacts, and health, and all the kinds of things that people need in order to have, right, a comprehensive approach to a great quality of life. And so we worked hard as a TA provider and capacity building provider on that program, and that program actually piloted the rule through the Fair Housing and Equity Assessment process. So we got involved with developing tools and technical assistance and kind of peer learning opportunities for the regions. There's 74 around the country. The Bay Area is one of the regions that actually piloted this affirmatively furthering fair housing rule. So it wasn't like cooked up in a back room. It really had a lot of input and testing, and those regions that piloted the rule got a set of draft guidance similar to what the real rule has and a set of data to use to kind of conduct these fair housing and equity assessments. So that's a little bit of our background with the rule and how I entered this space around the AFFH, which I'll call it that moving forward. Are you going to do the slides? Or should, let's right do here. It myself. Okay.
If I click right.
Okay, so I'm going to skip that slide and that one because we already talked, but it's not going anywhere.
Should be this one.
Oh, that one.
Yep, so right and left.
Okay, so we just want to, for today, really kind of understand, I could just go sit down. He did such a great job of I am sitting down. I could go back over there and sit some more. Did a really good job of framing up, some of the discriminatory policy practices that have gotten us to the place that we are. So we're going to just cover a little bit more of that, learn a little bit about the rule, explore the urgency and opportunities for you to participate in the assessment of fair housing process, you and your colleagues, and just kind of bringing your expertise and the body of work that you do into these processes is really important and critical. Understanding the threats to the rule, you'd be surprised to hear that it's operating under threat. That's a shock, right? And then administratively, and it has been threatened in Congress for ever since it was even fathomed. And then sometime to parent share and have Q&A. So I just like to start out by talking about government's responsibility to foster equitable communities for all residents, right? This is out of the AICP Code of Ethics. And so nobody that's really working in government or a planner should say that really dealing with issues of race and access to opportunity is not the work that we do. We're just doing community development work. And I think most folks in the work feel that way. But if we don't, with a concerted focus, work in that regard, then we end up with a lot of unintended consequences, which is where we're at today. So just to kind of shore up the purpose of the Fair Housing Act, according to Senator Mondale from the great state of Minnesota, where the smartest people in the world are from. I just want you to know that.
That's not where you're from.
Exactly. And most fabulous, right? So truly integrated and balanced living patterns is really about what we're trying to achieve through this work. And so the Fair Housing Act really says, in a nutshell, you cannot discriminate against people in accessing housing or steps towards housing, right? You cannot say based on your disability or based on your race or your national origin or your religion that we're not going to rent to you or because you have children. And so what the AFFH does is it really clarifies the need to go beyond that discrimination, blatant discrimination, framing to say, if Sarita Turner, who is an African-American woman, single parent or not, a parent, cannot access housing that she can afford in a community that offers her child the opportunity to have a great quality of education and to breathe clean air and to have like lead-free and non-toxic environment and connected transportation where she can get to work and access education and all those kinds of things, then I am still being discriminated against, right? Even though it's not a direct, you cannot live here, but it is a discrimination based on my race and situation in life that is still illegal according to the Fair Housing Act. And so there's case law on this refraining from discrimination as a broader goal of truly opening up housing, right? And so how the rule, this came about is that many complaints came from different communities about the fact that HUD was not doing its job in terms of, right, truly deconcentrating poverty in a way that does not foster displacement and really opening up, right, this housing choice in a way that allows people to experience the full benefits of what one should experience in their community. So this is just another protected class analysis, right? This goes beyond race. Race is a potential impediment, but that every protected class must be considered in, and that would then translate into federal protected classes and then what is additionally in place at the state level in the different states, right? So California has more protected classes than the federal level does. But basically, just to kind of get back to my point, I'm ahead of my slides, that I have to be able to access housing, right, in a way that affirmatively furthers my opportunities in life. So as we think about, oh, my slides are cool. It didn't do that when I went through it. So, you know, oftentimes segregation is only thought about in terms of race or national origin. But to your point about disabilities, now, what I will say is if you go through every single one of these categories and you disaggregate by data by race, you're still going to find people of color are discriminated against at a higher rate in every category, right? So we just really at PolicyLink want to always emphasize the importance, even if you're saying we're going to focus on the disability community, that's great, that's wonderful. You still need to disaggregate data by race because you are going to find disparities within the disability community between races, between genders, between, right, and all the kinds of things that actually we have to test in order to fully understand. So we know what a protected class means. I'm not going to go through that. Under the Fair Housing Act, right, the protected classes include. So the AFH is really looking at the full swath of protected classes, not just race. And that's a real big misunderstanding about the rule that as you do your walkabouts and think about it, you can clarify. This diamond is a really quick illustration of the entire AFH process. And what you will notice is that community participation and collaboration and partnerships are wrapped around the entire process. So community and stakeholders like you all should be at the table helping to design the assessment of fair housing process, right? The AFH sets out a process called the assessment of fair housing. It replaced the old analysis of impediments process that cities used to go through by really clarifying what it means to affirmatively further fair housing and giving tools to the HUD grantees in order for them to do the assessment and analysis. So this is the process. You're assessing past goals from other analysis of impediments process, analyzing fair housing issues and identifying the significant contributing factors are the cause or instigator of fair housing and access to opportunity issues, prioritizing the ones you're going to be able to address immediately, setting goals and strategies in order to address those, and then in this process what now has occurred is the regulation says now the funding you get from HUD, the CDBG, Community Development Block Grant dollars, and the Affordable Housing Home dollars have to be tied to these goals and strategies. You just aren't in this, like, ambiguous place of how we spend our CDBG and home dollars anymore. It really is about you will do this assessment and then tie these resources to their original intention. So I talked about the process is data advised. HUD provides a data and mapping tool and the real clear instructions on how to use it and a template on how to complete the AFH process. These are all the different indicators that are mapped by race and ethnicity, and looking at those kinds of trends over time. And as you will see, demographics and environmental health is one of the areas that's looked at that will be really important for you all. But also every community is required to bring in other supplemental data. So a lot of the data that Will was talking about, right, around I'm sorry. I didn't mean to do it. Is that Siri?
Can everyone on the phone still hear us okay? Or anyone on the phone hear us?
Yes, I can hear you guys.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay.
Should be good to go.
So bringing in that other supplemental data that HUD does not provide in the mapping tool is really critically important. Otherwise, it's not going to get considered in the assessment of fair housing process, and you really can't have a rich process that identifies all of the contributing factors to fair housing choice and access to opportunity if you don't do that. So that's a really important reason why all the different kinds of expertises and focus on issue areas need to be at the table and be involved. So Will talked about restrictive covenants and that kind of thing of the history of our country and why the AFFH is needed. It's why the Fair Housing Act itself was needed. So we all are familiar with redlining and how primarily during this time, African Americans were steered to and contained to certain neighborhoods. And not only were folks like population-wise steered there and said, you all need to live together because we shouldn't mix races, but those areas were also bled dry of any kinds of investments, right? And so if we look at this map of Baltimore, we can see, this is an old HOLC map, and you can see that the red areas in this 2012 map around the food, access to food, are the same areas pretty much that were redlined back then when this map was developed. And then if you look at dirty streets and alleys, you see the same trend. If you look at vacant properties, you see the same trend. And I also, please, this is not, don't talk about my mapping skills when you leave the room. But this is an old HOLC map of Oakland and Berkeley. And then this map on the right of it, if you're facing the screen, is the map that is pulled out of the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Data and Mapping tool. So you guys should go in there and play around with it. It's kind of fun. But this is the population. The red outline areas are the racially and ethnically concentrated areas of poverty, which is a big part of what is supposed to be looked at in the assessment of fair housing process. And you can kind of see the same redlined areas from that old map exist as racially and ethnically concentrated areas of poverty. And then you can also see that primarily blacks and Latinos live in those communities. So we see this same current day redlining playing itself out. This is a map from 2000, and then this is a map, that same map from 2010. And so to the point about displacement, right, and the challenging issues of housing in the Bay Area, and specifically what's happening in Oakland right now, you can already see in 2010 the displacement of people of color. Those areas of concentrated poverty are less populated with people of color, right? And you can kind of see the shift actually starting to occur. Will be interesting to look at the map today and see what we see.
Sarita, this is Edith on the phone. Can you please explain to us what redlining means to folks trying to buy homes?
I'm so sorry. Yes, I absolutely can. So redlining was a legal practice before the Civil Rights era that said that you could actually legally design neighborhoods by race, and that neighborhoods should not be racially mixed. And so redlines, a typical approach to identifying areas where African Americans would live and be steered in community development planning. You know, we're looking at, can they see the maps and stuff that we're?
You can see everything that's on the screen.
Okay, great. So if you were able to see those maps, you could see the red areas on those maps are the redlined areas. Thank you. And that those areas were the areas where it's like, we're going to put all our undesirable stuff here, all our undesirable people, and we're going to make this the undesirable place. We're not going to invest in parks and libraries and, you know, all the things that we need in order to have a great neighborhood and a great quality of life. And those are the areas that were back then primarily African Americans were steered to. And so moving forward into the modern day redlining, we can see that those are the neighborhoods primarily. This neighborhood that's on the screen now, I don't know, like we have lots of them all over the country, right? This is primarily where people of color, especially African Americans, Latinos, and Native Americans, can afford to live. So even though redlining now is illegal, it's a no-no, you can get in big trouble for it, it is baked into institutional practices and the way decisions are made. And so no planners like sitting around the room saying, you know what, let's create this community right here and let's have kids walking past all this horrific stuff and police tape and all the things that communities that our kids are growing up in today, and then we expect them to grow up and thrive and have a great view of what they can accomplish in life, right? All of these things are still happening because of modern day redlining. So it's really important for us to recognize how the conditions got to be the way they are, because it can be really easy for the rhetoric around personal choices and what, people can just lift themselves up by their bootstraps, and it can be easy to buy into that thinking if we don't really understand how things got to be the way they are. And imagine from birth a kid growing up in this kind of neighborhood and then expecting them to say, I can do it, I can thrive, I can do anything. And yes, we have anomalies. We have people like Ben Carson who come out of this, right, and achieve great things for whatever reason. But across the board, we are seeing lives wasted, people, brilliant people, just as brilliant as Ben Carson, their lives wasted, and a trajectory to prison or the graveyard or out on the corner drinking to drink away my sorrow and hopelessness because of the kinds of conditions that this country has created for them to live in, and that we are still exacerbating today. So I want to move on from that dismal challenging story that's true, to talking about, right, so this is really why it is so important for all of us to be involved in this assessment of fair housing process. If we're not involved, no matter how much our local city officials and county administrators and officials and states are invested in having a great process, it won't be robust and it won't be the kind of assessment that's needed unless we all get involved and we push them, right, to make this process robust and inclusive and bring in a broad set of stakeholders and leverage existing community resources and private sector resources into the process so once the goals of the AFH are set, they can actually be achieved. So this is just a little mock timeline that we put together of what the process looks like. This process is not linear, it's dynamic. So you will, right, it will move from not necessarily in this order, but the first thing should be that stakeholders and community members are a part of actually designing the process. You can't design a good community engagement process if that's not your expertise, right? So planners and cities and counties should be working with neighborhood organizations who actually have expertise in engaging communities and relationships with the folks who are residents in communities to move that process forward, and et cetera, right? They don't have access to all the data. Some of that data is with healthcare providers, and some of that data is with other institutional partners. So bringing all those folks into the process is critical. So I love you. So again, like assessing past goals and strategies and walking through the entire AFH process with all these different folks involved and getting to the publishing of the first draft and putting that out for public comment to the actual sign-off and submitting it to HUD is really important. Yes?
This is Muncie from Alameda. Can you clarify, so is that in terms of creating a timeline for creating an affordable fair housing plan, or what is it? Because it says published first draft, and I'm not sure what that is.
So it's the first draft of the assessment of fair housing.
Okay.
Right? So every jurisdiction, every state, every county, every public housing authority now has fallen under this rule. And they have to complete an assessment of fair housing. And that process makes them come into compliance with the affirmatively furthering fair housing rules. Does that answer your question? Yeah. And then you had a question.
Is it the same or different than what used to be called the analysis of impediments?
It's the new process, right? So now the analysis of impediments process no longer exists and has been replaced with the assessment of fair housing that offers guidance, data, and a template for how to complete the process to the grantees so that they have the analysis of impediments process was just complete one, right? So there was no kind of, we don't like to say standardized approach because every approach is locally driven and really is fostered by the community that the process, the assessment of fair housing happens in, but that there is some guidance around how to complete one and what is expected of you in completing one that helps it be a rich process. You had a question?
So when you say every jurisdiction has to complete this, do you mean like every city, then it has to feed up into the county and all that feeds up into the state?
No, so every city entitlement jurisdiction gets their own CDBG and home dollars from HUD, and then every county. So what will make sense when it's time for Oakland to go through their process is that they should partner with Alameda County to do it because both are required to do it, right? And what would make even more sense is to do it as a region, right? Because The housing and migration patterns and access to opportunity are regional issues. They're not going to okay, you can access opportunity in Oakland through these strategies that we develop, right? And then in San Leandro through these strategies that we develop, and then in right? So regional approaches are very encouraged, and it was piloted as a regional. They keep asking me questions and interrupting me. So, yes, but every single jurisdiction, and a jurisdiction is a city or a county, that is an entitlement jurisdiction has to complete this process. And then every state has to complete the process, and they will complete the process in partnership and on behalf of non-entitlement jurisdictions. So this really covers every single unit of government that receives HUD, CDBG, home, HOPWA, and ESA dollars. ESA. G. Sorry. Yes.
I was just are some of these done? And if some of them are done, where do we find them?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked me that question. On April 20th, 2017, at 10 a.m. Pacific time, PolicyLink and the Government Alliance on Racial Equity are hosting a webinar on the AFFH rule in Kansas City, Wilmington, North Carolina, and Philadelphia, who have gone through the process now, are going to be presenting on that webinar about their process and their thoughts about it and that kind of thing. And we're also going to have the immediate past Deputy Assistant Secretary of Community Planning and Development, Harriet Tregoning, talk about the rule. One of the key things that we want to emphasize about this process, and I can send more information to Will about how to actually get some of the AFHs that were completed. So during your spare time at night, you can read them. But anyway, so please join the webinar. I'll send the webinar information. I'll send some of the drafts as well. And then one of the things we're going to really talk about on the webinar is how this is a great planning tool for other planning processes, right? It doesn't just, this template, this tool, the look at the data, the mapping is really a great process that should then now be taken into other planning processes. And no matter what happens with this regulation, folks should still be moving forward with it. If we're all really committed to addressing the disparities in access to opportunity and dealing with this housing crisis, we have to start to look at planning through the lens of holistic, integrated planning, as well as disaggregated data by race, by ability, by all the kinds of things that the rule focuses on and more. So that's another key point of emphasis for the webinar and for today. You had a question.
Yeah, I don't know if I just missed it earlier. How often is this done, or when is it actually?
Oh, that's a great question. I didn't cover that earlier. So public housing authorities are required to complete the process every 3 years, and jurisdictions and states are required to complete the process every 5 years. So it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work. But no one should be complaining because you do it every 3 years or every 5 years. It's not like every single year you have to go through this big list, and it's a lot of work that needs to be done because of the great, just insurmountable challenges that we're now trying to dig ourselves out of so that we don't have children growing up in the picture, that community that I showed in the picture.
Is that template on your website?
Which one?
The one that you just showed for making a timeline?
No, but I can send it as well. And so these slides going to be made available to everyone?
Yes.
Okay, great. And I will send these, yes. So you can actually, we want people to take it and tailor it, and that's why it says insert the date and that kind of thing. So the last thing I'll say before I stop is we talked about the threat the rule is operating under, and Renee and I are both a part of a national working group called the AFFH Working Group, really creative name, right? That has been on the Hill every month educating Congress about this rule and about the importance of it since before it was actually released in July of 2015. Because that is, I mean, as soon as there was a draft rule, even before that, this Mike Lee, Senator Mike Lee from Utah and Senator Paul Gosar from Arizona have been working first in Congress to get Congress to defund the rules so that HUD has no funding actually to implement it. And now both of them have actually introduced bills. One is co-authored by Senator Rubio from Florida. If you know any of these folks personally, you should really get with them, right?
This is the wrong audience for that.
And it's, you know, you're always surprised by who people are related to. And so Senator Lee's bill is really around this. There's just all these lies, for lack of a better word, that they're telling about the rule. It's social engineering of that's what happened in redlining. Neighborhoods were socially engineered. People didn't have the choice of just going to live wherever they wanted to live. If you were a white person and you moved into a black neighborhood, you really were ostracized by the community overall, not the black community necessarily, but how are you going to go live there with those people, right? And if you were a black person and you wanted to move into a white community, you were prevented from doing that, and those who were the pioneers for that suffered tremendously. I just have so much respect for them because I would have went to jail. But anyway, so Gosar's bill goes even further than Lee's bill because Gosar is saying we're going to get rid of this. Says the mapping tools, but it really is about data disaggregated by race across the board. So he's saying the federal government has no business entering into space where they're using data disaggregated by race and some of these other demographics to make decisions. So as you can see, these are really detrimental bills, and we will keep you posted on how they're progressing. What we're hoping is because of all the other chaos that's going on, they won't even get heard. But if by chance they do, then we'll be working to mobilize every voice, every man, woman, child, and anything in between, bring the dogs, cats, everybody, to contact their members of Congress and tell them that this is a bad idea. So I will stop there, and I think you guys are going to pair and share now. Do we still?
Excuse me. I think I don't know if everybody on the phone was muted, but I was, and could I slip in a quick question?
Sure. I think for time, let's just do questions in a normal way. And then,
okay. Yeah. Okay. Sure. What's your question?
You had mentioned several times the CDBG funds supporting this process, and I'm curious what you think. Trump's budget not only proposes big cuts in HUD, but specifically eliminating CDBG funds, and I was curious, thinking about what that might do to the process you're trying to advance here. Thanks.
Yes. Again, CDBG is Community Development Block Grant dollars, and these dollars come from HUD with the purpose of actually investing in these chronic disparities that we've been discussing. And in many communities, Oakland is not one of them. I was so excited to learn that. But in many communities, they're not being utilized to address those issues. They're kind of being evenly divided amongst all the different council districts, and that is not the purpose of the funds. HUD exists to address poverty, right, and access to opportunity, not to make every community invest in every community. So that is what CDBG dollars are. So that's a great question. I'm glad you asked it because one of the things we've been worried about is that this rule will get dismantled, right? It'll get taken apart by another rule or defunded or blocked. And so what we started to hear from the administration was really nothing about the rule, and now Secretary Carson walked back on some of the comments that he made that were negative about the rule. The purpose of the rule, let me say that. But what we see now is, oh, you're just going to make it useless because without funding, there won't be any money to implement any of the strategies that are developed in response to the issues that the analysis uncovers. So, I mean, this is Trump's budget. It has to go through Congress and through a big process. There have been activities in the House in the past to really limit CDBG or to really kind of get rid of HUD. So we're watching this carefully to see what kind of position the House is going to take. We expect to have much more support in the Senate, and I should have said that, is that on the Senate side is where we have been able to defend the bill. There is bipartisan support. There has been bipartisan support for AFFH on the Senate side, so this hasn't necessarily been a Republican-Democrat regulation, which is great, but we need to continue to push our Republican members especially to support it. Did I answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Welcome. Any other questions?
I think we can just do one more.
Okay.
So the wording that the process that participants have to follow is identifying racially and ethnically concentrated areas of poverty. But is there also a piece where they have to identify racially and ethnically concentrated areas of wealth and also work on that?
Yeah. So that's a great question. So every community has to do, even like Oakland will have to do a regional analysis. If they partner with the other jurisdictions in the region, then they can come up with regional strategies, right, and work on them together. So they could say, hey, we're going to partner with Walnut Creek. And Walnut Creek, we're going to, right, one of the strategies is we're going to build affordable housing. And Walnut Creek, and another strategy might be to bring in the transit agency to say, hey, we're going to create greater connections to some of the job centers that are in the outlying areas, as well as invest in these racially and ethnically concentrated areas of poverty. So yes, the idea is to go back to Senator Mondale's quote about a balanced approach. One of the things about the rule that we have had a lot of good spirited conversation about is the integration segregation language, right? So when this rule was established in 1968, right, there was a big issue around redlining that the Fair Housing Act was created to address. And those dynamics are still playing out today, but because of segregation and redlining, the African American community, the Native American community, the Chinese community, Japanese, Korean, right, they have created community support systems and economies and have, across the country been able to foster business districts that offer ethnic ethnic opportunity as goods and arts and all those kinds of things. So we don't want to dismantle that, right? And we also don't want to send the message to people of color that if you just live around white people, your life will be better, right? Because that's kind of how people of color broadly, I can't speak for every person of color, but broadly hear that, right? We have to integrate. We have to integrate. No, we have to foster investments in a way that makes every community attractive for everyone to live in, and then we'll foster integration organically, right? So we don't want to take this approach, and I think it was the way that HUD frame this out of the gate, right, that we're working on integration. No, we're working on making sure people aren't discriminated against and that people can live wherever they want. Fair housing choice. So if I'm a black person, I want to stay in the black community, I want to live there, those investments are coming in to make my community great. And if I'm a black person who prefers to live in a more suburban environment or an environment that's not concentrated with a lot of black people, I have that opportunity as well. So yeah, looking at all of those and developing strategies to create a balanced approach is exactly what the rule is supposed to foster.
Great, thank you, Sarita.